The blizzard came down off the Sangre de Cristo Mountains like something with teeth. It was April of 1877.
Get up!
In
We
the
have to
high
go
valley
now!
where the
I
coal
can't,
ranch
the snow is
sat
too
had
deep.
been warming for
Take my
weeks,
hand,
the snow
now!
melt feeding
I'm
the
trying.
creek until it ran
I've got you
fast
now.
and brown
You're
through the
safe.
pasture.
It hurts.
Spring
I
had
know.
seemed like
Just
a
hold on.
promise kept. Then the sky turned the color of a bruise, and the wind swung hard from the north, and within an hour the world disappeared behind a wall of white. Elijah Cole had felt it coming. He always did. His father used to say that some men were born with ears that heard further than others, and Eli had learned not to question the instinct. By mid-afternoon, he had the cattle driven into the lower pasture where the tree line broke the wind. By 4, he had the barn doors secured and the horses blanketed. By the time the first hard gust hit the cabin, rattling the windows, his own hands had set. 6 years ago, Eli was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, listening. His brother Breck sat across from him, sharpening a skinning knife with long, slow strokes against a whetstone. The sound was steady and rhythmic, almost peaceful, though there was nothing peaceful about Breck Cole. At 28, he was the largest of the 3 brothers, built like something meant to break down doors. His shoulders were broad enough that he had to turn sideways through certain doorways in the cabin, and his hands, scarred from years at the forge, could bend horseshoe iron cold. He had a voice that carried across open country without effort, and a temper that could flare like black powder. But on the workbench in his smithing shed, hidden beneath a scrap of leather, sat a collection of small objects he had forged by lamplight when no one was watching. A hair clasp shaped like an oak leaf, a pendant in the form of a star, a tiny iron bird with wings spread wide, each one delicate, each one precise, each one a contradiction of everything Breck Cole appeared to be. He had never shown them to anyone. Shepard Cole, the youngest at 25, was in the corner, near the stove, reading the only book he owned, a veterinary manual he had taken from a dead Army surgeon's kit 3 years back. Shep had the same height as his brothers, the same broad frame, but there was something gentler in the way he moved, the way he spoke. He had spent the afternoon in the barn with a calf born too early, its mother having refused to nurse. He had wrapped the animal in a wool blanket, fed it from a bottle, and talked to it in a low, steady voice, as though it could understand every word. This was Shep's way. He could make any living creature trust him in minutes. Horses that shied from other men would stand calm under his hand. Stray dogs followed him home. Even the hawk that nested in the barn eaves had stopped screaming when Shep walked beneath. He had a gift for gentleness that seemed impossible in a man his size. But Shep also carried the sharpest memory of the 3 brothers. He had been 13 when their father was shot dead on a red dirt road in Oklahoma Territory. A dispute with road agents. A single bullet. Eli, 18 years old, had buried their father with his bare hands, while Breck, 15, stood guard with a rifle too heavy for him to hold steady. Shep had watched. He remembered the sound the dirt made falling on the blanket they wrapped their father in. He remembered how Eli's hands bled afterward, the skin torn from digging in rocky ground. He remembered the silence of the ride west that followed 3 boys alone in a country that did not forgive weakness. That had been 12 years ago. Eli had led them here to this valley and built the cabin with his own back and the help of one man. Old Mose was that man, 65 years old, born into slavery in Georgia, freed in 1865, and never once looking east again. He had walked west until the land ran out of flatness and became mountains, and that was where he stopped. He met Eli Cole in the spring of '72, when the 18-year-old was trying to raise a cabin wall alone, while his 2 younger brothers, skinny and sunburned, held ropes that were too heavy for them. Mose had watched for a while from the tree line, then walked over, picked up the 3rd rope, and pulled. He never left. Nobody asked him to stay. Nobody asked when he might go. He became part of the ranch the way the well was part of it, the way the old oak by the creek was part of it. He had always been here. He always would be. And there was Birch, 13 years old, small for his age, with sand-colored hair that refused to lie flat, and eyes that had seen too much too young. His father had been a copper miner in the Ortiz Mountains, killed in a shaft collapse. His mother had died of fever the year before that. Eli found the boy 2 winters ago stealing eggs from the hen house at dawn. Instead of running the child off, Eli had sat down on the porch step and asked if he wanted breakfast. Birch had been at the ranch ever since, doing chores, tending horses, and following Breck around the smithing shed with a devotion that the big man pretended to find irritating, but secretly treasured. These 5 souls occupied the Cole Ranch on the night of the April blizzard. The cabin was solid built of ponderosa pine and creekstone. The fire was steady in the hearth. The coffee was hot. Outside, the world howled. And then through the howling, Eli heard something else. Not the wind, not a branch breaking, not an animal. Something hitting the front door, faint, desperate, almost swallowed by the storm. Breck looked up from his knife. Shep lowered his book. Even Birch, half asleep on a blanket near the fire, raised his head. Eli was already moving. He crossed the room in 4 strides and pulled the heavy oak door inward. The wind shoved snow into his face, stinging his eyes, and for a moment all he saw was white. Then the white parted, and there she was. A girl, young, perhaps 20. Apache. Her hair was black and long, matted with snow and dried blood. She wore a deerskin dress that had once been well made, the beadwork along the yoke showing turquoise and red ochre. But the dress was torn from the neckline to the waist, the damage violent and deliberate. Her moccasins were shredded. Her legs were streaked with dust and dried mud and thin lines of blood from thorns or rocks. But it was her wrists that stopped Eli's breath. Both wrists were raw, the skin rubbed away in bands 2 inches wide, the flesh beneath swollen and weeping. Rope burns, deep ones. The kind that came not from a single binding, but from days, perhaps weeks of being tied. The kind that left scars. Her face was bruised along the left cheekbone and the jaw. Her lips were cracked from dehydration. A cut on her temple had bled and dried and bled again. She was shaking so hard that the tremor seemed to come from somewhere deeper than cold, from a place where the body itself had been pushed beyond its limits and was beginning to shut down. And her eyes. Her eyes were black, enormous, and burning. Not with fear, not with pleading, with something older and harder than either. This was the look of a person who had decided to live and would not accept death even though death stood directly behind her. She spoke in English, clear, precise English, though her voice shook with exhaustion rather than uncertainty. "They are coming. Please." Then her knees buckled. Eli caught her before she hit the ground. His arms went under her shoulders and knees, lifting her the way he would lift one of Shep's orphaned calves. And the thing that struck him first was how light she was. Too light. Lighter than a grown woman should be. The realization made something hot and dangerous move through his chest, something that felt very much like anger. He carried her inside and laid her on the long bench near the hearth. Breck was already on his feet, hand on his rifle, eyes on the open door. Shep moved to the stove, reaching for the kettle and the medicine box. Birch scrambled to pile more wood on the fire, but it was old Mose who spoke. The old man had come in from his quarters at the sound of the door opening. He stood in the kitchen doorway, still as timber, and looked at the girl on the bench, looked at her torn dress, looked at the bruises. Then his gaze settled on her wrists, on the rope burns, and something changed in his face. Something ancient and personal and terrible. He stepped forward, slowly. He held up his own wrist and turned it so the firelight caught the inner side where the skin was thinnest. And there beneath 65 years of living, faded but unmistakable, were scars. The same shape, the same width, the same story. "I know these marks," Mose said quietly. His voice was the lowest sound in the room. "I wore them for the first 20 years of my life." Nobody spoke. The fire cracked. The wind screamed outside. And the girl on the bench lay still, her chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. Her burned wrists cradled against her stomach, like wounded animals she was trying to protect. Eli looked at the girl's face, battered and exhausted, but still, even in unconsciousness, holding an expression of fierce, stubborn refusal to surrender. He pulled a chair to the bench and sat down. He would be here when she woke. She woke 2 hours later, and she woke fighting. One moment she was still. The next she was on her feet, pressed into the corner where the stone wall met the timber, her hands raised in front of her face, her eyes wild and scanning for threat. It was the reaction of someone who had been hit many times and had learned that sleep was the most dangerous time. Brexted bowed it forward instinctively, and the girl flinched so hard her back struck the wall. She made a sound, not a scream, but a sharp inhalation, the kind of sound a person makes when they expect pain and are bracing for it. Breck froze. The realization hit him like a fist to the gut. His size, his voice, his physical presence. To this girl, everything about him was a threat. She had been hurt by large men, and his body was telling her that he was one of them. Something moved across Breck's face. Pain. And then a decision. He stepped back, raised both hands, palms open, fingers spread, and then he sat down on the floor, folding his massive frame until he was below her eye line, making himself smaller, less threatening. It was a simple act. It said everything about who Brett Cole actually was. Shep knelt a few paces from her, his voice dropping to the low, even tone he used with frightened horses. "It is all right. Nobody here is going to hurt you. You are safe. My name is Shep." Eli stayed where he was, leaning against the far wall, arms loose at his sides, hands visible. He did not advance. He did not retreat. He watched her with calm, patient eyes, the eyes of a man who would wait as long as it took. "You are safe," he said. His voice was low, steady, certain. "Nobody here will touch you unless you want them to." The girl looked at him. Her dark eyes moved across his face, searching for the lie. She had heard words like these before. She had heard them from the guard who said, "Behave and you will not be beaten." She had heard them from the man in the expensive hat who smiled as he inspected his merchandise. But there was something in Eli Cole's eyes that made her pause. Not pity, not desire, not curiosity, just truth, simple and solid as the stone wall behind her. She lowered her hands, slowly. Not trust. Exhaustion that had finally overrun vigilance. They learned her name was Kestrel. In her own language, Ishkane, the girl who runs fast. She did not tell her story all at once. It came in fragments over the next hours, between sips of the broth that Shep heated and the careful cleaning of her wounds. Some things she said, other things she could not say, and the silence where words should have been told, its own story. Her father had been a minor chief among the Mescalero Apache. Her mother, an extraordinary woman by any measure, had learned English from a missionary and had taught her daughter, believing that understanding the enemy's language was a sharper weapon than any blade. Her mother died of consumption when Kestrel was 15. Her father was killed in a skirmish with cavalry 2 years later. 6 months ago, a small group of Apache women and children, Kestrel among them, along with an older woman named Naka, who had become a second mother to her, were captured in a coordinated attack between soldiers and local militia. They were sold to a man named Victor Harshaw. "Harshaw," Eli repeated. His jaw tightened so sharply that the muscles stood out along his neck. "You know him?" Kestrel asked, surprise breaking through her exhaustion. "He buys cattle from Santa Fe. Businessman with a reputation." Eli's voice carried a bitterness that was new to his brothers. "On the surface, at least." Kestrel continued, and what she described turned the air in the cabin cold in a way that had nothing to do with the blizzard outside. Harshaw was not a common bandit or slave trader. He wore vests and fine hats. He spoke with courtesy. He carried documents, labor contracts, signed and witnessed by a judge in Santa Fe. On paper, Kestrel was not a victim. She was contracted labor who had not yet repaid her transportation and maintenance debts. And the law, the same law that the Cole brothers had respected and obeyed their entire lives, stood behind Harshaw like a loaded rifle. Harshaw kept a camp where his captives were held. They were bound, forced to work, beaten when they resisted. Kestrel had tried to escape 3 times. Each attempt earned her new bruises, new rope burns, less food. But Harshaw had not sold her. He told her she was special merchandise. He was waiting for a specific buyer. She did not know who that buyer was or what he wanted, and the not knowing was its own kind of torture. A darkness that her mind populated with every terrible thing she had ever heard of or imagined. She had escaped 4 nights ago during a transfer through the mountains. She ran. For 4 days and 4 nights, she ran, drinking from streams, eating roots, and bark, crossing terrain that would have turned back healthy men. She ran until her moccasins disintegrated and her feet bled on the rocks. She ran until her body tried to stop and her will refused to let it. And then she found the cabin. And then she fell through the door. And then she told them the thing that made the room go silent in a way that even the storm could not fill. "I am not the only one. There are 7 others, women and children. Naka is among them. She is 50 years old and her ribs are broken, and they still make her work. I promised her I would come back." The silence held. Breck spoke from his place on the floor. "You just escaped from that hell, and you are talking about going back." Kestrel looked him directly in the eye. "Would you leave your brothers behind?" Breck did not answer. He did not need to. The question answered itself. Old Mo sat in the kitchen doorway, his weathered face unreadable, his scarred wrists resting on his knees. He said nothing, but when Kestrel looked at him, he nodded once. A small movement, an acknowledgement between two people who understood the same darkness. Eli rose from his chair. He looked at Breck. He looked at Shep. He looked at Old Mose. He looked at Birch, who had been listening from the corner, with eyes wide and mouth shut the way children listen when they understand that the adults around them are making decisions that will change everything. Then Eli looked at Kestrel. He knew what he was about to say would put everything at risk. The ranch he had built over 12 years with bleeding hands and an aching back. The safety he had scraped together for his brothers. The fragile, hard-won stability of their lives. All of it would go on the table. But then Eli looked at her asleep on the bench, with her hands curled against her stomach, and he knew. "You stay here," he said, "and when you are strong enough, we go find the others." Kestrel stared at him. For the first time since she had arrived, something other than survival flickered in her dark eyes. Something cautious and fragile and very close to hope. The next morning the storm had passed, leaving the valley white and silent, under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Eli saddled his horse before dawn and rode alone into Pecos Crossing, the nearest settlement, a half-day journey through mountain trails, still slick with snowmelt. He needed medicine for Kestrel's infected wounds. But what he found in town was something far more dangerous than infection. At the general store, Maggie Pratt, a sharp-eyed widow of 50 who ran the best supply operation in the territory and knew more about everyone's business than they knew themselves, pulled Eli into the back room. She closed the door. She spoke quickly and quietly. "Eli Cole, listen to me carefully. Harshaw's men have been riding through every ranch and settlement in the territory. They are asking about an Apache girl who ran from his camp. He is calling her contracted labor and says he has legal documents to prove it. He has Sergeant Leland Cross and a squad of soldiers backing him. He says the girl is his property, and anyone harboring her is breaking the law." Eli said nothing. His face did not change, but his hands resting on the counter went very still. At the saloon next door, through the thin wall, he heard a stranger's voice asking the barkeeper a question. The voice belonged to a man he would later come to know as Pruitt, a bounty hunter in Harshaw's employ. The question was simple. "Anybody seen an Indian girl come through this way? Mr. Harshaw is offering $50 for information." $50. 3 months' wages for a working cowboy. Enough to loosen any tongue in town. Eli bought the medicine. He thanked Maggie. He rode home. That night, with the fire burning low and the mountains black against the stars, the Cole family held a council. Eli insisted that Kestrel be present. She had demanded it first. "This is my fight," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of a woman who had spent her life being spoken about and was finished with it. "I do not sit and wait for others to decide my fate." Eli nodded. Respect moved behind his eyes, though he did not name it. He laid out the situation with the same cold precision he used when counting cattle or calculating feed for winter. "Harshaw has legal documents. He has soldiers. He has a bounty on information. We can hide Kestrel, but not forever. This valley has one road in, and everyone knows we are here. He will find her. The only question is when." Breck's response was immediate. "Then we fight." "Fight who?" Eli asked evenly. "United States soldiers with 3 rifles." Silence. Then Shep spoke. He had been quiet all evening, sitting near the stove, turning something over in his mind, the way he turned soil in his garden patiently, thoroughly. "There is one way," Shep said. "Under federal law, the wife of an American citizen cannot be seized or detained for the debts of another party. If Kestrel marries one of us, Harshaw's contract becomes void." Every eye in the room turned to Shep. He shrugged the gesture, almost apologetic. "I read Doc Whitfield's law books. When there is nothing else to read, you read what is available." The silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before. It was the silence of people standing at a crossroads, knowing that every direction leads somewhere they cannot return from. Kestrel understood what was being proposed. Marriage to a stranger, a white man, a legal maneuver dressed in the clothing of a sacrament. Her mother's voice rose in her memory, steady and sure. "Use the enemy's weapons against the enemy." "I agree," Kestrel said, "on one condition. This is a shield, not a chain. I am not property, not Harshaw's, not anyone's." "Agreed," Eli said. You will have your own room, your own lock. Nothing changes unless you say it does. Who? Kestrel asked. The single word hung in the air. Breck looked at Eli. Shep looked at Eli. Old Mose looked at Eli. Birch looked at Eli. I will, Eli said. Breck opened his mouth. His jaw worked. Something between protest and understanding fought behind his eyes. Then Old Mose placed a hand on Breck's shoulder and shook his head just slightly. The old man saw what Breck had not yet recognized. Eli did not say, I will, out of duty. Shep studied his oldest brother's face and saw it too. Something that Eli himself had not yet admitted. Something that had been there since the moment he opened the door and caught a stranger before she hit the ground. Nobody spoke it aloud. Some things are too new and too fragile for words. Eli turned to Kestrel. Tomorrow morning we ride into Pecos Crossing. We find the Reverend. We make it legal before Harshaw can move. Kestrel held his gaze. Her dark eyes searched his face one more time, looking for the lie, the hidden motive, the trap. She found nothing but steadiness. The kind of steadiness that came not from softness, but from a man who had buried his father, raised his brothers, built a home from nothing, and never once broken a promise. Tomorrow morning, she agreed. The fire burned low. The stars blazed cold and bright above the valley. Somewhere out in the darkness beyond the mountains, a coyote sang its thin, lonesome song into the night, and no one answered. But on the only road that led from the high valley down to Pecos Crossing, camped beside a cold creek with no fire to give away his position, Pruitt the bounty hunter sat in the dark and waited. He was a patient man. He had learned early in life that patience was the most dangerous weapon a man could carry. Quieter than a gun, more reliable than a knife. He had followed the Cole brothers' tracks from town. He knew where the girl was. He knew they would have to come down this road in the morning. And he knew that whatever they were planning, Victor Harshaw would want to hear about it before they could make it happen. Pruitt was not alone. 3 men sat with him in the darkness, their horses picketed downstream, where the sound of water would cover any restless stamping. Hard men, paid men, men who asked no questions about the work as long as the money was real. Tomorrow the Coles would ride down, and Pruitt would be ready, not to stop them, to watch, to confirm, and to send a rider to Santa Fe before the sun reached its peak. Because Victor Harshaw did not become the most powerful man in the territory by using force alone. He became powerful by knowing things before other people knew he knew them. And what Pruitt was about to learn, whatever the Cole brothers were planning for the girl, Harshaw would know within 48 hours. The wind died. The snow settled. The valley held its breath. And inside the cabin, in the room that Eli had given her, behind a door with a lock, that she controlled, Kestrel sat on the edge of the bed and looked down at her wrists. The rope burns were still raw, still angry, still whispering the story of 6 months of captivity and 4 days of desperate flight. She touched the bone pendant at her throat, her mother's pendant, the last physical thing she had from the life before. She closed her eyes and spoke in Apache softly to a woman who could no longer hear her. I found something, mother. I do not know what it is yet. But the man with the quiet voice made a promise, and I think he might be the kind who keeps them. She lay down. She did not sleep easily. She never did. But for the first time in 6 months, when she closed her eyes, the darkness behind them was not populated entirely by fear. There was something else there now, small, uncertain, fragile as a flame in wind, but alive. They rode out before first light. The valley was still white with the storm's leavings, but the sky had cleared to a cold, deep blue that promised a dry day. Eli led on his bay gelding, riding with the easy posture of a man who had spent more of his life in a saddle than out of one. Kestrel rode beside him on the paint mare that Shep had chosen for her, a steady animal with a calm temperament and sure feet on mountain trails. She rode well. Eli had noticed that the first time he watched her on horseback, the way she moved with the animal, rather than against it, her body finding the rhythm without conscious thought. She had learned to ride before she learned to walk, she told him. Apache children did. Behind them rode Breck, his rifle across his saddle, his eyes moving constantly across the terrain. And behind Breck, Shep, carrying the saddlebag with the marriage documents that Doc Whitfield had helped prepare the evening before, along with enough ammunition to make a point without starting a war. Old Mose and Birch stayed behind to guard the ranch. Before they left, Mose had pressed a second pistol into Eli's hand. For the left, the old man said. Nothing more. Birch had stood on the porch in the pre-dawn darkness watching them go. He wanted to ride with them. He was 13 and he believed himself ready for whatever the world might bring. But Eli had placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and spoken quietly. "I need someone I trust to stay here. Can you do that for me?" The boy straightened. He nodded once. He would stay. The trail from the high valley descended through a series of switchbacks carved into the mountainside, dropping nearly 2,000 feet over 8 miles before reaching the main road to Pecos Crossing. The terrain was rocky, the footing treacherous with snowmelt, and there were places where the trail narrowed to a single horse width between the cliff face and a drop that would kill anything that slipped. It was at one of these narrow places where the trail passed through a gap between two massive boulders that they found Pruitt. He was not hiding. That was the first thing Eli noted, and the thing that worried him most. Pruitt sat his horse in the center of the gap, relaxed, his hands visible on the saddle horn, a thin smile on a face that seemed designed for smiling in situations where other men would not. 3 riders flanked him, positioned with the casual precision of men who had done this before. 2 on the right, 1 on the left, covering the angles. No weapons drawn. No threatening movements. Professional. "Cole brothers," Pruitt called out, his voice carrying pleasantly through the morning air. "Fine day for a ride." Eli reined up. Behind him he heard Breck shift in his saddle, heard the faint creak of leather that meant his brother's hand was moving toward the rifle. Eli raised his left hand slightly. "Wait." Pruitt's eyes moved past Eli and found Kestrel. His smile widened, though it never reached his eyes. "Well now, Mr. Harshaw's girl. He has been worried about you, you know. Said you got lost in the storm. Wants to make sure you are safe and sound." Breck's voice came from behind, like the low rumble before a thunderclap. "She looks real safe with those rope burns on her wrists." Pruitt's smile did not change. "Indians hurt themselves all the time. Hard to say how these things happen." What happened next was not what Pruitt expected. Kestrel urged her horse forward, not behind Eli, not to the side. Forward until she was level with Pruitt, close enough to see the small scar on his jawline and the calculation behind his easy expression. She looked at him the way a hawk looks at something crawling in the grass. Not with fear, with a contempt so cold it could have frozen the snowmelt on the rocks around them. "Tell Harshaw," she said, and her voice carried the same quality as the iron that Breck shaped in his forge, hard and ringing and final, "that I was not lost. I ran. And the next time he wants to find me, he should come himself instead of sending dogs." Pruitt's smile faltered. Just for a moment. Just enough for Eli to see it. Then Eli moved his horse up beside Kestrel. Not in front of her, beside her, shoulder to shoulder. The distinction was deliberate, and Pruitt was smart enough to read it. "We are coming through," Eli said. "Now." Pruitt studied them. He studied the way Eli's hand rested near the pistol at his hip without touching it. He studied Breck, who had not bothered with subtlety, and was holding his rifle across his chest with the barrel pointed in Pruitt's general direction. He studied Shep, whose expression was calm, but whose eyes were tracking the 3 hired men with an attention that suggested he had already decided which one to shoot first, if it came to that. Pruitt moved his horse aside. His men followed. "Ride easy, Cole," Pruitt said as they passed. "I will let Mr. Harshaw know his merchandise is in good hands. He will be pleased to hear it." They rode through the gap. No shots, no confrontation. But as they cleared the boulders and the trail opened onto the wider road, Eli felt the knowledge settle into his bones like cold water. Pruitt had not been there to stop them. He had been there to confirm, to see Kestrel with his own eyes, to note the direction they were headed, and to send a rider south before the day was out. This was not a blockade, it was a clock, and it had just started counting down. They reached Pecos Crossing by mid-morning. The settlement was small by any standard, a single main street of wooden buildings baking in the sun, a general store, a saloon, a livery stable, a tiny white church at the far end, and a scattering of houses and businesses that served the ranches and homesteads spread across 100 miles of mountain territory. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where a stranger's arrival was noted within minutes and discussed within hours, where secrets lasted about as long as morning frost. Reverend Isaac Dalton was in the church sweeping the floor. He was 60 years old, thin, with a tremor in his hands that had grown worse since his wife died and the bottle had become his closest companion. He was not a bad man. He had been perhaps a good man once, for the territory's cruelties had worn his courage down to a nub. Now he was a frightened man, which is a different thing entirely. When Eli told him what was needed, the Reverend set down his broom and shook his head. I cannot, Eli. Harshaw will. He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, unable even to name the specific threat, because the fear was larger than any single act. You do not understand what he can do. I understand exactly what he can do, Eli said quietly. I also understand what he is doing. Right now, to 7 women and children who do not have anyone riding into town to speak on their behalf. Dalton's hands shook. His eyes dropped to the floor. Then Kestrel spoke. She stepped forward, her torn deerskin dress still bearing the evidence of her captivity, the rope burns on her wrist still raw, the bruise on her cheekbone still fading from purple to yellow. She stood before the Reverend, and when she spoke, her voice held no anger, no pleading, only clarity. Reverend, I ran 4 days through the desert to escape the man you are afraid of. I did not eat. I did not sleep. I drank water from mud puddles and ate roots that made me sick. I did these things because I decided that dying free was better than living as property. I am not afraid of Harshaw. You have less reason to be afraid than I do. Dalton looked at her, looked at the rope burns, looked at the bruise. Something moved in his face, something old and nearly forgotten. Something that might have been shame and might have been, after all these years, the last spark of the man he had been before. Fear burned the rest away. I will do it, he said. His hands still shook, but his voice for the first time in a long time did not. Maggie Pratt arrived within the hour. Shep had ridden ahead to alert her, and she came bustling through the church door with the energy of a woman who had been waiting years for something worth bustling about. Behind her came Doc Whitfield carrying his medical bag and a fountain pen, and behind him, moving slowly but with the unmistakable dignity of a man who understood the gravity of what was about to happen, came old Mose. He had left Birch in charge of the ranch and ridden through the night. You did not think I would miss this, Mose said, when Eli looked at him in surprise. I left the stock fed and the gates locked. One morning will not undo 12 years of building. Then more quietly, some things a man needs to see with his own eyes. The witnesses assembled, Maggie Pratt sharp-eyed and approving, Doc Whitfield steady and kind, old Mose standing at the back with his hat in his hands, Breck positioned near the window where he could watch the street, Shep holding the documents and trying not to look emotional and failing entirely. Kestrel stood at the entrance of the small church. The dress she wore was the same torn deerskin, but old Mose had spent the previous evening mending the worst of the damage with thick leather thread and clumsy, careful stitches. The beadwork along the yoke still showed turquoise and red ochre and bone white, the colors of her mother's people. She had no father to walk her down the aisle. No family at all in this room, in this town, in this territory. She had herself. That had always been enough before. Then Birch appeared, not at the ranch where he was supposed to be. Here in the doorway of the church, out of breath, his sand-colored hair wilder than usual, his shirt buttoned wrong. He had ridden after Mose in the dark and arrived by a different trail, pushing his little Mustang hard over terrain that would have given a grown man pause. Mose shook his head at the boy, but said nothing. There was no sending him back now, and truth be told, the old man had half expected him to follow. Mister, Eli told me to stay, the boy said, preempting the reprimand he could see forming on Breck's face. But Mr. Mose said some things a man needs to see, and I figured this was one of those things. He turned to Kestrel, straightened himself to his full height, which was not much, and attempted the most serious expression his 13-year-old face could manage. Mr. Eli asked me to ask you if maybe you would want me to walk with you, up to the front there. Kestrel looked down at the boy, orphan like her, cast adrift by the world like her, taken in by a man who understood that family was not always blood like her. I would be honored, she said. Birch offered his arm. His elbow barely reached her rib cage, but the dignity with which he held it would have put a general to shame. Kestrel placed her hand on it, and together they walked the 12 steps from the church door to the place where Eli Cole stood waiting. Eli watched her come toward him and felt something shift inside his chest, some load-bearing wall he had built long ago to keep the world at a distance. She was bruised and scarred and thin from hunger, and wearing a mended dress in a church that smelled of dust and old wood, and she was the most remarkable thing he had ever seen. The ceremony was brief. Reverend Dalton spoke the traditional words with a steadiness that surprised everyone present, including himself. When the time came for vows, Eli's voice was low and certain, the voice of a man who understood that promises were not decorations, but structural elements, things that held weight, things you built a life on. Kestrel spoke her vows in English, clear and sure, and then so quietly that only Eli and the Reverend could hear, she repeated them in Apache, the language of her mother, the bridge, not the barrier. When Eli took her hand, his rough, calloused, enormous hand, engulfing her smaller one, he looked down at their joined fingers and thought, this is not the hand of someone who needs rescuing. This is the hand of someone who has been rescuing herself for 20 years, same as me. He leaned close, close enough that his words were for her alone. Those marks on your wrist, he said, they are the last. On my life. Kestrel did not speak, but her fingers tightened around his just for a moment, just enough. Outside, as they stepped into the hard New Mexico sunlight, as husband and wife Doc Whitfield drew Eli aside. The old physician's face was troubled. Eli, while you were inside, I saw a rider leave town heading south, riding hard. I could not be certain, but he looked very much like one of the men who was with Pruitt on the mountain road. Eli absorbed this the way rock absorbs rain, silently, completely. How long ago? 20 minutes, perhaps 30. 30 minutes south at a hard gallop. By tomorrow evening, Harshaw would know everything. The marriage, the church, the witnesses, the legal shield that now stood between him and the girl he considered his property. The clock that had started ticking on the mountain road was running faster now. They returned to the ranch before dark. Kestrel rode beside Eli in a silence that was different from the silences they had shared before. There was something new in it, something that neither of them had words for yet. A door had been opened. Neither knew what lay on the other side. At the cabin, Eli showed Kestrel to the room that was still hers, with the door that's still locked from the inside. He handed her the key, the same promise. Nothing has changed, he said, not unless you want it to. She took the key. Their fingers touched in the exchange and the contact lasted a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Neither mentioned it. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt against all probability almost natural. Mornings belonged to coffee. Eli rose before dawn, built up the fire, and set the pot on the stove. He would pour 2 cups and leave one outside Kestrel's door, never knocking, never waiting. The gesture was simple, silent, reliable, like Eli himself. On the 4th morning, Kestrel came downstairs before he could place the cup. She stood in the kitchen doorway, and he stood by the stove, and they looked at each other in the gray light of pre-dawn, and then without a word, she took the cup from his hand and sat at the table. He sat across from her. They drank their coffee and watched the sunrise turn the mountains gold through the window. It became their ritual. Each morning earlier and earlier until they were both in the kitchen before the first light touched the peaks. They did not speak much during these mornings. They did not need to. The silence between them had become a language of its own, one that said, I am here, and that was enough. Eli taught Kestrel to ride with a saddle and stirrups the Western way that allowed longer rides over rougher country. She already rode beautifully bareback and bridleless in the Apache fashion, but the saddle gave her range, and range meant freedom. One afternoon, she galloped the paint mare across the south pasture, her black hair streaming behind her, her body moving in perfect unity with the horse, and Eli stood at the fence line and watched until Shep appeared beside him and cleared his throat with exaggerated patience. Brother, the fence will not mend itself. Eli blinked, picked up his hammer, said nothing. But the tips of his ears were red, and Shep, who noticed everything, smiled to himself and said nothing further. Breck's relationship with Kestrel was the most complicated of the three. He was acutely, painfully aware that his physical presence frightened her. Not always. Not as badly as the first night. But there were moments when he entered a room too quickly or raised his voice in the way that was natural for him, and he would see her stiffen, see her hands move in that defensive gesture that was pure reflex, and each time it happened, it cut him somewhere he could not name. He solved it the way Breck solved most problems, with iron. He began announcing himself before entering any room where she might be. A knock on the doorframe, a whistle, a deliberate heaviness in his footstep that gave her time to prepare. It was a small accommodation, and he never spoke of it, but Kestrel noticed. She noticed everything. The breakthrough came 12 days after the wedding. Kestrel went to the smithing shed looking for Eli, who had been helping Breck repair a wagon axle. She stepped through the open door and found Breck alone at the forge, the fire burning orange, his massive arms working the bellows. The heat and the noise and the sight of him, huge and powerful and wreathed in sparks, should have triggered every alarm her body had learned to sound in the presence of dangerous men. But then she saw what he was making. On the workbench beside the anvil, held in a small vise, was something that bore no resemblance to an axle or a horseshoe or any of the practical things that a ranch blacksmith was expected to produce. It was a hair clasp, shaped like an eagle feather, made of iron but worked so thin and with such delicacy that it seemed to float above the wood it rested on. The barbs of the feather were individually rendered. The quill tapered to a point fine enough to write with. Breck saw her looking. His face went red. His hands, which could bend iron bars, fumbled the bellows chain. He reached for the clasp with the obvious intention of hiding it behind his back. "Who is it for?" Kestrel asked. Silence. Long, agonizing silence. The fire popped. "You," Breck said, addressing the floor. "Saw your hair keeps falling in your face. Thought maybe you could use something to—" He made a vague gesture that encompassed the entire concept of hair management. "Never mind, it is stupid. Forget it." Kestrel crossed the shed. She took the clasp from the vise with careful fingers, turned it in the light, examined the impossibly fine detail. Then she gathered her hair, the thick black hair that had been her mother's pride, and pinned it back with the iron feather. "Beautiful," she said. "You forge better than you talk." Breck stared at her, and then he laughed. It came out of him like something that had been locked in a cellar for years, big and warm, and startled by its own existence. The sound filled the smithing shed and bounced off the stone walls and rolled out into the afternoon. From that day forward, Kestrel did not flinch when Breck entered a room. With Shep, the connection was easiest. They became friends in the uncomplicated way that two people of similar temperament find each other. Shep showed her his garden, the herbs and vegetables he cultivated behind the cabin, and was delighted to discover that she knew plants he had never encountered, Apache remedies for ailments that his veterinary manual did not cover. She taught him. He taught her. They argued about the best way to grow tomatoes in high-altitude soil, and neither of them won because they were both wrong, and the tomatoes grew by however they wanted regardless. Kestrel told Shep about her mother, about the woman who had believed that language was a bridge, not a barrier, who had spent her life building bridges that her own people sometimes distrusted and the other side rarely honored. Shep told Kestrel about his father, about the last thing the man had said before the bullet took him, the words spoken to a 13-year-old boy who would carry them for the rest of his life. "Every living thing deserves care, even the snake. But watch the tail." They laughed easily together, and one afternoon a sound drifted across the yard to where Eli was mending a bridle on the porch. The sound of Kestrel laughing, full, genuine laughter, the kind that comes from the belly and surprises the person making it. The first time she had laughed like that since her mother died. Eli looked up. He listened. Something complicated moved through him. Joy that she could laugh. And something else, something small and sharp, that it was Shep who had made her laugh and not him. He went back to the bridle. He did not mention it. But Shep, crossing the yard later, caught his brother's eye and saw something there that made the youngest Cole brother stop and think for a long moment about the difference between a man who protects someone out of duty and a man who protects someone because he cannot imagine a world without them in it. Old Mose and Kestrel shared something that the brothers could observe but not fully enter. It happened on a night when sleep would not come for either of them. Kestrel sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, staring at the stars. Mose came out and sat beside her in the chair that was always his, the one with the legs worn smooth from years of use. He spoke slowly. He told her about Georgia, about the plantation, about the sound of the overseer's boots on the path outside the quarters at 4 a.m, about the rope that bound his wrists when he was 9 years old and tried to run for the first time, about the second time he tried at 14 and the beating that followed, about the third time at 22 in 1865 when the world had changed just enough to let him get away. "Same kind of running," he said, looking at her wrists. "Same kind of marks." She placed her hand on his wrist, gently, where old scars met new ones. "Do they fade?" she asked. "They fade," Mose said. "They do not disappear, but one day you look down and you think of freedom instead of pain." They sat together in silence after that, two people from different worlds who had survived the same darkness, and the silence between them needed no translation. On the 10th night the nightmare came. Kestrel dreamed of Harshaw. Ropes, darkness, the sound of boots on packed earth. She woke gasping, tangled in the quilt, unsure for 3 terrible seconds whether the cabin was real or the dream was. A soft knock at her door, Eli's voice low and careful. "Kestrel, are you all right?" She opened the door. He stood in the hallway in his trousers and undershirt, his dark hair disordered from sleep, his eyes holding the particular quality of worry that comes from a man who has already been awake listening because he sleeps lightly in a world that has taught him the cost of sleeping deeply. "Nightmare," she said. "I get them too," he said. "My father. Every time I close my eyes, I see him fall." A pause. The hallway was dark except for the moonlight coming through the window at the far end. "Would you like me to sit until you fall asleep in the chair there?" He pointed at the rocking chair beside her window, several paces from the bed. Close enough to comfort, far enough to respect. She nodded. He entered. He sat. The chair creaked softly as he settled his weight. He did not speak. He did not need to. His presence in the room changed the quality of the darkness, made it less hostile, less populated, with the shapes of things she feared. "My mother used to say," Kestrel murmured, her eyes closing, "that nightmares are spirits trying to drag you back to the darkest place you have been. The only way to stop them is to create enough light where you are." "Your mother was wise. She was the strongest person I ever knew." A pause. "Until recently. She did not say until I met you." But Eli heard what she did not say. He heard it the way he heard the storm before it arrived, with the part of him that listened deeper than ears. She slept. When morning came and she opened her eyes, Eli was gone. But the blanket from his own room was folded neatly on the rocking chair, still holding warmth. And outside her door, a cup of coffee, steaming. She touched the blanket. Warm. He had only just left. Something turned over in her chest. Something that was not fear and was not gratitude and was not anything she had a name for yet. 3 weeks after the wedding, on an afternoon when the sun was high and the sky was the hard blue of a territory that never apologized for its beauty or its harshness, dust rose from the road into the valley. Eli saw it first. He was on the porch repairing a saddle, and the movement of the dust cloud registered in his peripheral vision the way a predator registers motion in grass. He set down the saddle and stood. 10 riders, coming up the valley road at an unhurried pace that was more threatening than any gallop. At the front rode a man on the finest horse Eli had ever seen, a black thoroughbred that moved like money and power had been bred into its bones. The man wore a gray vest over a white shirt, a silk cravat, and a hat that cost more than most men earned in a month. He was 45, clean-shaven, with the kind of face that looked respectable in photographs and reasonable in courtrooms, and would have been entirely convincing if not for the eyes. The eyes were the color of creek water in winter, empty and cold, and completely without mercy. Victor Harshaw. Beside him rode Sergeant Leland Cross in the blue uniform of the United States Army, his service sword at his hip, his face carrying the expression of a man who knew he was doing something wrong and had decided that the money was worth the knowing. Behind them, Pruitt and 7 hired guns. Eli did not reach for a weapon. He stood on his porch with his hands at his sides, his weight balanced, his eyes fixed on Harshaw, with an attention that was neither aggressive nor submissive. It was the attention of a man taking precise measure of a threat. From the corner of the cabin, Breck materialized like a shadow gaining substance. His rifle leaned against the wall within arm's reach. Inside, through the kitchen window, the barrel of Shep's rifle was visible to anyone who knew where to look. And from the barn, old Mose watched through the hayloft door, his ancient Spencer repeater trained on the group, with the steady hand of a man who had learned to shoot in circumstances that did not allow for missing. Kestrel stood behind the front door, out of sight, holding the knife that Breck had forged for her. The blade was 10 inches long and balanced for throwing. Breck had shown her how. She had taken to it with a natural precision that surprised them both. Harshaw dismounted. He moved with the deliberate grace of a man who understood that physical presence was a negotiation tool. He removed his hat, revealing silver-touched hair combed with care, and he smiled. "Mr. Cole, my name is Victor Harshaw. I believe you have something that belongs to me. Eli's voice was flat. Nobody here belongs to anyone, Mr. Harshaw. Ah, Harshaw produced a folded document from his vest pocket and held it up. I have here a labor contract signed and witnessed for an Apache woman known as Kestrel. She is indebted to me for transportation, housing, and management costs incurred during her contracted period of service. She departed before fulfilling her obligations. I am here to collect what is legally mine. The words were smooth, practiced, delivered with the casual confidence of a man who had used them before and expected them to work. Because they always had. Because the law in this territory in this time was a tool that served those who could afford to sharpen it. Eli reached into his own shirt pocket. He unfolded a document of his own and held it out. This woman is my wife, Kestrel Cole, married in the sight of God and 6 witnesses at the First Church of Pecos Crossing, officiated by Reverend Isaac Dalton. Your contract, if it was ever valid, is void. A citizen's wife cannot be seized for another party's debts. Something happened to Harshaw's face. The smile remained, but the structure beneath it shifted the way the surface of a lake remains smooth while the current beneath changes direction entirely. He had not expected this, but Victor Harshaw had not become the most powerful man in the territory by being unable to adapt. Marriage, he said softly, to an Indian. I wonder how many judges in this territory would recognize such a union. Enough, Eli said. Sergeant Cross stepped his horse forward. His hand moved toward his sword hilt. Now see here, Cole. I am authorized by the territorial government to... Breck stepped out from the corner of the cabin. He did not hurry. He picked up his rifle with one hand, the way another man might pick up a walking stick, and he held it across his chest with the barrel pointed in the general direction of everything that was wrong with this situation. You are authorized to get back on your horse, Sergeant, Breck said. This is private land. You do not have a warrant. You have a piece of paper from a man who buys and sells human beings, and if you reach for that sword again, I will assume you mean to use it and act accordingly. The silence that followed had weight. It pressed down on the valley like a physical thing. 10 seconds, 20, 30. The horses shifted. A hawk circled overhead, indifferent to the affairs of men below. Harshaw looked around the property. He counted the guns. He calculated the angles. He was not a man who underestimated opposition, and what he saw in the eyes of the Cole brothers was not bluff. It was certainty. The quiet, bone-deep certainty of men who had already decided what they were willing to die for and had made their peace with it. He remounted his horse. He replaced his hat. He smiled. This is not finished, Cole. I will return with a judge, a federal war warrant, and enough men to take what is mine. And when I do that, marriage of yours will not be worth the paper it is written on. He turned his horse. Cross followed, unable to meet Eli's gaze. Pruitt tipped his hat with mocking courtesy and brought up the rear. 10 riders, moving down the valley road, raising dust that took a long time to settle. Eli watched until the last of them disappeared around the bend where the valley met the lower hills. His hands, which had been perfectly steady throughout the entire confrontation, began to shake. He pressed them flat against the porch railing until they stopped. Kestrel stepped through the front door. The knife was still in her hand. Her dark eyes met his. We cannot wait for him to come back, she said. We have to go to the others first. Eli looked at her. She was right. If they could free the captives, if they could find evidence of Harshaw's trafficking in his camp records, the legal foundation of his entire operation would collapse. The contracts would be exposed as instruments of slavery. The judges and soldiers who had colluded with him would scramble to distance themselves. Harshaw would lose not just his claim on Kestrel, but everything he had built his empire upon. Can you lead us to the camp? Eli asked. I can. Something sharp and certain flared behind her dark eyes. I will. That night, by lamplight, Kestrel drew a map on the back of a flour sack. Her hand was steady and sure. She marked the trails, the water sources, the landmarks, the approach routes to the narrow canyon where Harshaw kept his captives. Eli studied the map. Breck studied the map. They planned. The next morning, 3 riders left the Cole Ranch heading south. Eli, Breck, and Kestrel. Shep stayed behind with Old Mose and Birch armed and watchful. If Harshaw returned before they did, Shep was to hold the ranch and send Birch riding for Maggie Pratt in town, who would raise whatever alarm she could. Come back, Shep said to Eli as they mounted up. His voice carried something that he usually kept buried beneath his easy humor. "All three of you, come back." "We will," Eli said. They rode south, 3 days through the open country of the New Mexico territory. The landscape was vast and in different mesas, rising like broken temples from the desert floor, their red and orange and cream layers recording millennia of time that made human concerns seem small and temporary. Cactus stood in the sandy flats like sentinels with their arms raised. The sky was enormous, a dome of blue so deep it made a person feel simultaneously insignificant and free. At night, they camped in arroyos and dry washes, building small fires that they smothered before full dark. The stars overhead were thick as scattered grain, more stars than Eli had ever seen even in 12 years of living under western skies. Coyotes called from the ridgelines, their voices thin and ancient and without loneliness, because loneliness was a human invention and coyotes had no use for it. During the days Kestrel led, she read the terrain the way Eli read cattle instinctively, her eyes finding water and shelter, and safe passage where he saw only rock and dust. She knew which plants could be eaten and which would kill. She knew the signs that indicated a flash flood was possible, or that a rattlesnake den was near, or that riders had passed through within the last day. Eli watched her and understood something that shifted the way he thought about her. She did not need saving. She needed allies. The difference was everything. On the second night, beside a fire built in the shelter of a sandstone overhang, Kestrel asked him, "Why did you choose this to marry me? To protect me? You could have sent me away and avoided all of this." Eli looked at the fire for a long time. The flames moved in the way that flames always move, without plan, but with purpose, consuming what they touched and turning it into light. "When you came through that door," he said finally, "I saw someone who had fought with everything she had to stay alive. I have been that person. My brothers have been that person. Turning you away would have been turning my back on everything I believe. Is that the only reason?" He looked at her. The firelight caught the amber in his eyes and turned it gold. "No, it is not." He did not elaborate. She did not press. But the space between them, the careful measured distance they had both maintained since the beginning, grew smaller in a way that had nothing to do with physical proximity. From across the fire, Breck watched them. He had been cleaning his rifle, a task that required attention, but his hands had stilled. He studied his brother's face and saw what was written there. The thing that Eli had not yet said aloud and might never say aloud, because Eli Cole expressed the most important things in his life, not through words but through actions. Through coffee left at a door, through a key placed in a hand, through a night spent in a rocking chair. Breck reached into his vest pocket and took out a small object wrapped in leather. He had been carrying it for days, waiting for the right moment, and now he knew that the right moment might never exist and that any moment was better than none. "Eli," he said, and tossed the leather bundle across the fire. Eli caught it reflexively, opened it. Inside was a ring. Silver, thin, delicate, the band engraved with a tiny mountain range that anyone who had ever seen the Sangre de Cristos at dawn would recognize immediately. Breck had forged it in his shed over 3 nights, working by lamplight after the others were asleep, using skills he had never shown anyone because the things he made in secret were the truest things about him. Eli stared at the ring, then he looked at his brother. Something moved in his eyes that Breck had never seen there before, something that the oldest Cole brother kept locked away so deep that even his own family rarely glimpsed it. Emotion without armor. "Thank you, Breck. Do not thank me. Give it to her tomorrow. I spent 3 nights on that thing, and I would rather not carry it anymore." Eli closed his hand around the ring. He nodded. He did not trust his voice to say more. The fire burned down. They took turns keeping the watch. And somewhere in the darkness to the south, 7 women and children waited in a place they could not leave, guarded by men who did not see them as people. And one of them, an old woman with broken ribs and unbroken eyes, looked up at the same stars and whispered a prayer in a language that had been spoken in this land for 1,000 years before the first white man ever saw it. "Hold on," the prayer said. "She is coming back. She promised." And Kestrel, lying on the hard ground 2 days right away, opened her eyes in the dark and spoke silently to the woman who could not hear her. "I am coming, Naka. I promised." She touched the bone pendant at her throat. She touched the iron feather in her hair. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow they would reach the canyon. Tomorrow everything would change. The fire died to embers. the stars turned overhead. And the desert ancient, impatient, and indifferent to the hopes and fears of the small creatures that moved across its face waited for morning. They found the canyon on the third day exactly where Kestrel said it would be. It was a narrow cut in the earth carved by some ancient river that had long since dried to dust its walls, rising 40 feet on either side in layers of red and cream sandstone. The entrance was barely wide enough for two horses abreast, and from a distance it looked like nothing, a shadow on the face of the desert, a crack in the world that a person could ride past 100 times and never notice. But Kestrel noticed. She had been dragged through that entrance 6 months ago, with her wrists bound and a rope around her neck, and she had memorized every feature of the rock, every twist of the path, every shadow and handhold, because a prisoner who does not study her cage is a prisoner who has given up, and Kestrel had never given up. They left their horses picketed in a dry wash a mile north of the canyon, where a stand of junipers provided cover, and a small seep of water would keep the animals content until they returned. They went the rest of the way on foot, moving slowly, staying below the ridgeline, using the terrain the way Kestrel's people had used it for generations as armor and concealment and ally. By late afternoon, they were positioned on the rim of the canyon, lying flat against the warm sandstone, looking down at Victor Harshaw's camp. It was smaller than Eli had expected and more organized than he had feared. A timber stockade fence 10 feet high blocked the canyon at its narrowest point. Behind the fence, two large canvas tents stood in the shade of the canyon's west wall. A cooking fire smoldered near the entrance. 3 horses were picketed at the far end of the enclosure, near a natural spring that seeped from the rock and collected in a shallow pool. 3 guards. One sat near the fire cleaning a pistol. Another leaned against the stockade gate, his hat pulled low, either sleeping or close to it. The third was somewhere inside the larger tent, visible only as a moving shadow against the canvas, and beyond the guards barely visible through the gap between the 2 tents figures. Small, still, seated on the ground with the particular immobility of people who have learned that movement attracts attention and attention brings pain. Kestrel's hand closed on Eli's forearm. Her grip was fierce. He could feel the tremor running through her, not fear but rage held in check by discipline. "Naka," she whispered, the one sitting apart from the others, near the spring. "That is her." Eli followed her gaze. An older woman, thin to the point of frailty, sat with her back against the canyon wall. Even from this distance, he could see the way she held her left side, the careful, shallow breathing of someone protecting broken ribs. Her hair was gray and loose around her shoulders. She was looking up at the sky. They watched the camp until the sun went down and the guards lit lanterns and the desert cold settled into the canyon like water filling a well. They counted movements. They timed the guard changes. They mapped every angle and obstacle between the rim and the tents. Then they retreated to their horses and planned. 3 guards, Eli said, keeping his voice low. 1 at the gate, 1 at the fire, 1 inside the tent. The gate guard changes every 4 hours. The fire guard does not move. The tent guard moves between the tents, checking on the captives. When the tent guard is inside, Breck said, the fire guard cannot see the gate. There is a blind spot, maybe 20 seconds. "That is enough," Kestrel said. Eli looked at her. "You go in through the back. There is a gap where the fence meets the canyon wall on the south side. You told me about it." "I dug it wider when I escaped," Kestrel confirmed. "It should still be there. You go in, you reach the captives, you keep them quiet and ready to move. Breck takes the gate guard. I take the fire guard. When the tent guard comes out for his rounds, Breck handles him." "No killing," Breck said. It was not a question. It was a confirmation. They had discussed this on the ride south, and Eli had been clear. "We do not kill unless we have no choice. We are not them." "No killing," Eli agreed. "Knock them down. Tie them up, gag them. We want Harshaw alive and standing trial, and dead guards give him ammunition to paint us as murderers." Breck nodded. His jaw was set and his eyes were calm, the way they always were when the talking was done and the doing was about to begin. Breck Cole was not a man who was at his best in conversation. He was at his best when the world narrowed to a single task and the only tools required were his hands and his nerve. They waited for the moon to set. When the canyon was at its darkest, they moved. Kestrel went first. She moved through the desert scrub with a silence that made Eli realize, not for the first time, that the girl he had married was not simply brave or resourceful. She was skilled, trained. Her mother had taught her language, but her father had taught her to move like this to become part of the landscape, to pass through the world without leaving a mark. She reached the south wall of the canyon and disappeared into the shadows where the stockade met the rock. Eli counted to 100. Then he moved. The fire guard was sitting with his back to the approach, which was either laziness or overconfidence. Eli came up behind him low and fast, one hand closing over the man's mouth, the other pressing a pistol barrel against the back of his skull. The guard stiffened. Eli spoke directly into his ear, so quiet it was barely more than breathing. "Make a sound, and it is the last one you make, not if you understand." The man nodded. Eli bound him with rawhide cord, gagged him with his own bandana, and laid him on his side near the fire. The whole thing took less than 30 seconds. The man's eyes above the gag were wide and white, but he did not struggle. Something in Eli's voice had communicated with perfect clarity that this was not a negotiation. At the gate, Breck worked with the same efficiency. The gate guard had indeed been half asleep, which meant he woke to the sensation of being lifted off the ground by his collar and the sight of Breck Cole's face filling his entire field of vision like a mountain that had grown arms. Breck's hand covered the man's mouth. His other hand removed the man's pistol from its holster with the casual ease of someone picking a flower. "Quiet," Breck said, just the one word. The guard went quiet. Inside the tent, the third guard heard nothing. He was making his rounds, walking between the two tents, checking the captives, with the bored disinterest of a man performing a task he had performed 100 times. When he pushed through the flap of the larger tent, he found Kestrel. She stood among the captives who were awake and silent, their dark eyes gleaming in the faint light. The older woman, Naka, was on her feet beside Kestrel, one arm wrapped protectively around a child who could not have been more than 6. The guard opened his mouth. Kestrel hit him. Not with the knife, though she carried it. With the heel of her hand driven upward into the point of his chin, a strike she had learned from her father at age 12. The guard's head snapped back. His eyes rolled and he dropped like a sack of grain. Breck, appearing through the tent flap behind him, caught the body before it hit the ground and lowered it silently. "Remind me never to make you angry," Breck whispered. "You could not make me angry," Kestrel replied. "You are too slow." Breck blinked. Then he grinned. In the middle of a rescue operation in the dark in enemy territory, Breck Cole grinned. They moved fast after that. Kestrel spoke in Apache, low and urgent, explaining that they were here to free them, that horses waited to the north, that they had to move now, and move quietly. The captives rose. 7 women and children. Some were unsteady, some were injured, and all were silent. They had learned silence the hard way, and now silence would save them. Naka needed help. Her broken ribs had healed badly, and every step sent pain through her that she could not entirely hide, though she tried. Breck solved the problem by picking her up. He simply bent, scooped her into his arms, and stood. Breck had carried fence posts heavier than this woman, and the thought of it put the same heat behind his eyes that Eli had described feeling on the night Kestrel arrived. Something between fury and grief aimed at every person responsible. Naka looked up at the enormous man carrying her. She could not see his face clearly in the dark, but she could feel the steadiness of his arms and the care with which he moved, avoiding every stone that might jar her ribs. She spoke in Apache. Kestrel, walking beside them, translated in a whisper. "She says you have the heart of a bear, large and fierce, but what it knows..." Breck said nothing. He held the old woman closer and walked faster. They cleared the canyon. They reached the horses. They mounted the captives, doubled up with the 3 rescuers and on the 3 guard horses that Eli had taken from the camp. They rode north into the darkness, away from the canyon, away from the place that had been a prison for 6 months, and the night swallowed them whole. But before they left, Eli had found what he was looking for. In the smaller tent, the one that served as Harshaw's office, when he visited the camp, there was a desk. A portable writing desk, the kind that folded into a box for travel with compartments and drawers, and a lock that Eli broke with his knife in 3 seconds. Inside was a ledger, leather-bound, meticulously maintained, written in a clear, educated hand. Eli opened it by the light of a shielded lantern and read the first page, then the second, then the third. Names, dates, amounts paid and received. The names of every person Harshaw had captured, purchased, or sold over the past 3 years. The names of the buyers, the names of the intermediaries. The names of the soldiers who provided captives and the judges who signed the fraudulent contracts, and the businessmen who purchased human beings and called them employees. It was a complete record of a slave trade operating in plain sight under the protection of territorial law. Eli turned to the last pages where the most recent transactions were recorded. He found Kestrel's entry, her Apache name, Ish Kane, the date of her capture, her physical description clinical and dehumanizing, the notation special merchandise hold for specific buyer, and beside that notation, the name of the buyer. Colonel Horace Whitmore, United States Army, Commanding Officer, District of New Mexico. Eli stared at the name. He read it twice, 3 times. Then he closed the ledger, placed it inside his shirt, and walked out of the tent into the night. He found Kestrel outside helping an Apache child onto one of the guard horses. He touched her arm. She turned. He opened the ledger to the page and held the lantern so she could read. She read. The color left her face, not from fear, from a rage so pure and so complete that it went silent the way a blade goes silent when it reaches its edge. He ordered me, she said. Her voice was flat, controlled, each word placed with the precision of a blade. A colonel in the United States Army placed an order for me. Eli closed the ledger. He will answer for it. They all will. Every name in this book. The return journey was slower than the ride south. 7 exhausted women and children, some doubled on horses, some barely able to sit upright, could not be pushed at the pace 3 able riders had set. They rode through the night of the rescue and rested the following day in a sheltered arroyo while Shep's medical knowledge, relayed through Kestrel's memory, guided their treatment of the worst injuries. Then they rode again, carefully stopping, often covering ground that had taken 3 days southbound, in 4 days heading north. They reached the coal ranch on the evening of the 4th day. Shep was waiting on the porch, rifle in hand, his face haggard from days of watching and waiting. When he saw them coming up the valley road, all of them alive with 7 additional souls trailing behind, he set down the rifle and sat down hard on the porch steps as though his legs had finally admitted what they had been hiding for 4 days, that they were shaking. "You came back," he said when Eli dismounted. "I told you we would." Shep looked at the captives, at the children, at Naka in Breck's arms. His eyes went bright. All of them. All of them. Birch came running from the barn, skidding to a halt when he saw the group. His young face cycled through surprise, confusion, and then something like fierce pride. He ran to help Breck lower Naka from the horse, handling the old woman's weight with a care that belied his years. The next hours were a blur of activity. Shep tended the injured with his veterinary knowledge, adapted to human patience, cleaning wounds, splinting a child's broken finger, making poultices for Naka's ribs. Old Mose heated broth and baked bread and said nothing and did everything. Birch ran between the barn and the cabin, carrying blankets, water, whatever was needed, with the tireless energy of a boy who had found his purpose. Eli rode into Pecos Crossing that same night. He could not wait. Every hour that passed was an hour Harshaw could use. He found Doc Whitfield at home reading by lamplight. He placed the ledger on the doctor's desk and said, "This needs to reach the federal marshal in Santa Fe, not Sergeant Cross, not any territorial authority. The federal marshal directly." Doc Whitfield opened the ledger. He read the first page. His face, already thin and lined, seemed to age 10 years and 30 seconds. "Dear God," he said quietly. "It goes to the top," Eli said. "Colonel Horace Whitmore, United States Army. He is in that book." The doctor closed the ledger. He removed his spectacles and cleaned them, a gesture that had nothing to do with the spectacles and everything to do with needing a moment to process what he had just learned about the world he lived in. "I will go myself," he said. "I will not trust this to any messenger, any mail coach, any intermediary. I will ride to Santa Fe and place this in the marshal's hands personally. It is 2 weeks' ride. Then I had better leave in the morning." Doc Whitfield left at dawn the next day, the ledger secured in his saddlebag, a pistol he had not fired in 20 years holstered at his hip. He was 55 years old, not a young man, not a strong rider. But some things demanded more of a person than they believed they had to give, and this was one of those things. 12 days after the rescue, 8 days since Doc Whitfield had ridden south. The ranch had settled into a watchful calm, the kind of calm that soldiers know, the calm before the order comes. The freed Apache women and children had been housed in the cleaned and warmed barn and storage buildings. Two families among them had expressed a desire to stay in the area rather than attempt the dangerous journey back to Mescalero territory. Eli had offered them land along the eastern edge of his property where the soil was good and the creek provided water. Kestrel served as the bridge between the two worlds, translating, explaining, mediating the small misunderstandings that arose between people who did not share a language but were trying to share a valley. Shep, meanwhile, had acquired a habit of riding into Pecos Crossing more frequently than ranch business strictly required. The reason was 5 feet 3 inches tall, wore spectacles, and had arrived from Philadelphia 6 months earlier to teach at the new schoolhouse. Her name was Carolyn Webb, and she had a tendency to trip over things that were not there and to lose track of sentences halfway through because a thought about botany had interrupted a thought about arithmetic. Shep had met her at Maggie Pratt's store while buying seed packets, and their conversation about the growing season had lasted 2 hours and covered topics ranging from soil composition to the migratory patterns of hummingbirds. He brought her herbs from his garden instead of flowers because he did not know that flowers were traditional and because Caroline Webb preferred herbs anyway. By autumn, it was understood by everyone in the valley, except possibly Shep and Caroline themselves, that a second wedding at the coal ranch was only a matter of time. Naka grew stronger under Shep's care. Her ribs were mending. She spent her days sitting in the sun on the cabin porch, watching the valley with eyes that had seen the worst of what humans could do and had somehow retained the ability to find beauty in a mountain and a clear sky. Breck built her a chair first, then when it became clear that Naka intended to stay through the winter and beyond, he built her a small house. It took him 3 weeks working between his regular duties using timber from the same stand of ponderosa pine that had provided the wood for the main cabin. One room, a stone hearth, a door that faced east toward the sunrise. When he finished, he carried Naka's few belongings inside and left without ceremony. The old woman stood in the doorway of her own home, the first she had possessed in over a year, and spoke a single word in Apache. Kestrel, watching from the porch, translated for Breck later. The word meant son. Then came the morning that Eli had been expecting since the day Kestrel fell through his door. Dust on the valley road. More dust than 10 horses could make. More than 12. Eli stepped onto the porch. He counted the riders as they emerged from the tree line at the valley's mouth. 15. Harshaw at the front on his black thoroughbred, Sergeant Cross beside him, in full uniform, Pruitt riding behind, and 12 hired guns spread in a loose formation that covered the width of the valley road. This was not a negotiation. This was an army. Breck, Eli called. His voice was calm. Shep, Mose. They came. They had been waiting, each in their own way. Breck from the smithing shed rifle already in hand. Shep from the garden pistol on his hip. Old Mose from his quarters, the Spencer repeater that had not missed a target in 40 years cradled in the crook of his arm. Birch appeared at the barn door. Eli shook his head. Inside Birch, with the others. For once, the boy did not argue. He disappeared into the barn, and Eli heard the heavy crossbar drop into place behind the door. Kestrel came out of the cabin. She carried the knife at her belt, and in her hand was the Winchester that Eli had taught her to use over the past weeks. She moved to stand beside Eli on the porch. He looked at her. You should be inside. I should be exactly where I am. He did not argue. He knew better. And in the quiet part of his mind, the part that observed everything and judged nothing, he admitted that he would not have wanted her anywhere else. Harshaw dismounted at the fence line 60 yards from the porch. He was dressed impeccably as always. The silk cravat, the fine hat, the vest. The costume of a civilized man worn by someone who had made a fortune selling human beings. Sergeant Cross dismounted beside him. The sergeant unfolded a document and read aloud, his voice carrying across the distance with the trained projection of a military man. By the authority vested in me by the territorial government of New Mexico, I am hereby authorized to execute a warrant for the arrest of Elijah Cole on charges of theft of contracted property, obstruction of lawful commerce, and assault upon lawful agents of a registered business enterprise. I am further authorized to take into custody one Apache female known as Kestrel, formerly contracted to Mr. Victor Harshaw, pending resolution of said contract dispute. The words hung in the morning air. Legal words, official words, words that sounded like law and smelled like corruption. Eli stepped to the edge of the porch. His hands were at his sides, open, visible. No weapon drawn. but his voice when he spoke carried a quality that every man present recognized. The quiet, absolute certainty of a man who has looked at his own death, acknowledged it, and decided to finish his business first. Harshaw, you and I both know that Warren is counterfeit, and I know something you do not. Harshaw's composure flickered, a crack in the mask. And what might that be? Your ledger, the one you kept in your camp office. Names, dates, prices. Every person you captured, bought, and sold for the last 3 years. The names of the judges who signed your contracts. The names of the soldiers who provided captives. And the name of your most important client. Eli paused. Let the silence work. Colonel Horace Whitmore, Commanding Officer, District of New Mexico. The name landed like a bullet. Harshaw's face went white. Not the white of fear, but the white of a man who has just heard the sound of his entire world collapsing. Because Harshaw understood instantly what the exposure of Whitmore meant. Whitmore was not just a client. Whitmore was the keystone, the man whose authority protected the entire operation. If Whitmore fell, every judge, every soldier, every businessman connected to the network would turn on each other with the desperate savagery of animals caught in a trap. And the first person they would sacrifice to save themselves would be Victor Harshaw. You are lying, Harshaw said, but the certainty was gone from his voice. That ledger left this ranch 8 days ago, Eli continued, his voice as level as the horizon. It is on its way to the United States Federal Marshal in Santa Fe. Not your judges, not your soldiers, the federal government. By the time you ride back to Santa Fe, Marshal Ephraim Farrell will be reading your handwriting. Silence. The kind of silence that falls when the ground shifts beneath a man's feet, and he realizes that the place he is standing is no longer solid. The hired guns looked at each other. They had been paid to retrieve a runaway girl and intimidate a rancher. They had not been paid to die for a slave trader whose operation was about to be dismantled by the federal government. One by one, the calculations showed on their faces. The math of risk and reward computed by men who survived by knowing when the odds had changed. Pruitt was the first to move. The bounty hunter turned his horse with a deliberate, almost theatrical calm. My contract is concluded, Mr. Harshaw. I wish you well. He touched his hat brim in a gesture of farewell that contained not an ounce of respect and rode toward the valley mouth. 3 men followed him, then 4 more, then another 2. Within 60 seconds, Harshaw's army of 15 had become 5. Harshaw crossed and 3 men who were either too loyal or too stupid to read the situation. Harshaw stared at the departing riders. Something broke behind his eyes. The careful, cultivated facade, the civilized mask he had worn for years crumbled. What was left beneath was exactly what Kestrel had always known was there. A man who owned people. A man who, when stripped of his power and his protections, was nothing but appetite and rage. He drew his pistol. He did not aim at Eli. He aimed at the upper window of the cabin where he believed Kestrel would be hiding, because in Victor Harshaw's mind, a woman was always hiding, always cowering, always waiting to be found and taken and used. But Kestrel was not in the upper window. She was on the porch, standing in plain sight, and she was looking directly at him. 2 shots rang out simultaneously, so close together that they sounded like one. Breck from the corner of the cabin shot the pistol from Harshaw's hand. The gun spun away into the dirt, and Harshaw screamed, clutching fingers that would never hold a weapon steadily again. Shep from the kitchen window put a bullet through the crown of Sergeant Cross's hat. The hat flew off the sergeant's head and landed 6 feet away, a neat hole through the center. Cross, suddenly hatless and suddenly aware of exactly how close to death he had just stood, raised both hands above his head with a speed that would have been comical in other circumstances. Eli walked down from the porch. He crossed the 60 yards to where Harshaw knelt in the dirt, cradling his bleeding hand, and he stood over the man who had bought and sold human beings and called it business. It is over, Harshaw, Eli said. Finished. Harshaw looked up at him. The civilized mask was gone entirely now. What remained was small and ugly and afraid. You have no idea what you have done, Cole. The people I work with, the people who depend on me, they will come for you. They will burn this ranch. They will destroy everything you have. No, Eli said quietly, they will not. Because in 2 weeks, every one of them will be too busy trying to save themselves to give you a single thought. You are alone, Harshaw. For the first time in your life, You have no one standing between you and what you deserve. Old Mose appeared from the barn with a length of rope. He bound Cross's wrists with the efficiency of a man who had spent a lifetime studying knots. When he was finished, he stood back and looked at the sergeant in his uniform hands, tied hat in the dirt. 60 years, Mose said, his voice as calm as still water. 60 years I have been waiting to tie the hands of a man in uniform. The Lord works in ways that are not always mysterious. Sometimes they are very clear. The three remaining hired guns surrendered their weapons without protest. Birch emerged from the barn and collected the guns with the solemnity of a boy performing his first serious duty. Kestrel walked from the porch to where Harshaw knelt. She stood in front of him, and for a long moment she simply looked at the man who had kept her in chains for 6 months, who had called her merchandise, who had sold her mother's people like cattle. She did not hit him. She did not spit. She did not speak a single word of anger or triumph. She simply held up her wrists, turning them so Harshaw could see the scars that circled them, fading now but permanent. Then she turned her back on him and walked away. And that was worse than any blow. The complete, absolute dismissal of a man who was no longer worth the effort of her hatred. 2 weeks later, United States Federal Marshal Ephraim Farrell rode into Pecos Crossing with 4 deputy marshals and a warrant signed by a federal judge in Santa Fe. The warrant was comprehensive. Victor Harshaw was arrested on charges of kidnapping, trafficking, in persons fraud, and conspiracy. Sergeant Leland Cross was stripped of his rank and arrested as a co-conspirator. The investigation into Colonel Horace Whitmore was initiated immediately and within a month would expand to encompass military installations and territorial offices across 3 states. The marriage of Elijah Cole and Kestrel Cole was reviewed and affirmed by the federal court. The judge, a stern New Englander named Harding, who had been sent west specifically to address the lawlessness that men like Harshaw had exploited, read the marriage certificate, looked at the couple standing before him, and said simply, "This court recognizes this union without reservation." Next matter. At the preliminary hearing in Pecos Crossing, Kestrel took the witness stand. She spoke in English clear and unwavering, and she told the story. All of it, the capture, the camp, the ropes, the months of captivity, the escape. She spoke for 40 minutes, and in that time the only sound in the courtroom was her voice. When she finished, she looked at Harshaw, who sat in chains at the defendant's table. She did not flinch. She did not cry. She looked at him the way a person looks at a closed door that they have walked through for the last time. Then Naka stood. The old woman rose from the front bench where she had been sitting beside Breck, and she walked to the witness stand without being called. The judge looked at her. The prosecutor looked at her. No one stopped her. There are moments when the formality of law recognizes something older and more powerful than itself, and this was one of those moments. Naka spoke in Apache. Kestrel translated, her voice steady. "I am 50 years old. I have buried my husband and 3 of my children. I have seen my people driven from land that was ours before your grandfather's grandfathers were born. I have survived things that would kill your spirit if I described them to you. But I stand here, and the man who put chains on my wrists sits there, and I want him to know that I will walk out of this room and he will not. And that is enough. That is justice enough for me." The courtroom was silent for a long time after that. Harshaw was transferred to Santa Fe for trial. He would not see freedom again. Spring turned to summer. Summer burned hot and bright across the valley, the kind of heat that tested everything in the land, the livestock, the people. But the Cole Ranch endured as it always had, through work and stubbornness, in the particular kind of love that expressed itself not in words, but in the daily accumulation of small, faithful acts. Kestrel settled into the ranch not as a guest and not as a dependent, but as a partner. She worked alongside the brothers, riding the fence lines, tending the garden that she and Shep had expanded with Apache herbs and medicines, helping old Mose in the kitchen, teaching Birch to track and to read the weather by the behavior of animals. She was the bridge between the ranch and the 2 Apache families who had settled on the eastern acreage, translating not just language but culture, mediating the small frictions that arose when people from different worlds tried to share the same valley. The nightmares came less often. When they did, Eli was there. Sometimes she heard him before the knock, the soft creak of the hallway floorboard that meant he was already awake, already listening, already close. Sometimes she opened the door and he was standing there with 2 cups of coffee, as if nightmares at 3 in the morning were simply an excuse for an early start. They did not speak of love, not in those words, but it lived in the space between them, growing in the way that strong things grow slowly and from deep roots. It lived in the coffee every morning, in the rides across the valley where their horses drifted closer until their boots nearly touched, in the evenings on the porch when their shoulders found each other and neither pulled away. One evening as the summer heat began to ease, and the aspens on the mountainside showed the first faint blush of gold, Eli sat beside Kestrel on the porch and took the small leather bundle from his pocket. He had been carrying it since the night in the desert when Breck tossed it across the fire. He had been waiting for the right moment. He had come to understand that the right moment was not something you found. It was something you made. I should have given you this sooner, he said. Inside the leather was the ring, silver thin, the band engraved with the Sangre de Christos at dawn. Kestrel held it in her palm. She turned it in the fading light. She looked at the mountains on the metal and then at the mountains on the horizon and saw that they were the same. Breck made it, Eli said. I am not good at making beautiful things with my hands. I only know how to build fences and chase cattle. You are good at keeping promises, Kestrel said softly. That is more beautiful than any ring. She put it on. It fit perfectly. They sat in silence, shoulder to shoulder, the way they always did when the day was done and the valley turned gold. The distance between them, the careful, measured space they had both maintained since the beginning, closed at last. Not with urgency or drama, but with the quiet certainty of two rivers joining. She leaned against him. He put his arm around her. The valley turned purple. The first stars appeared. That night, for the first time, the door between their rooms stayed open. And the morning after, when Kestrel came downstairs, there was no cup of coffee outside her door, because Eli was already in the kitchen, and the cup was in his hand, held out to her with a smile that transformed his weathered, serious face into something she wanted to see every morning for the rest of her life. Then on an evening in early autumn, when the aspens had gone fully gold, and the air carried the sharp promise of the coming cold, Kestrel sat beside Eli on the porch and said the words that changed the axis of his world. Eli, I have something to tell you. He turned to her. Concern crossed his features immediately, the reflexive worry of a man who had learned that important announcements usually carried pain. Old Mose told me I should see Doc Whitfield, she said. He said he thought the ranch would be needing a smaller bed soon. Eli stared at her. She took his hand and placed it against her stomach. Understanding arrived. It moved across his face like sunrise, crossing a mountain, illuminating everything it touched. Shock first, then wonder. Then something so large and so bright that it seemed to remake the man from the inside out. Elijah Cole, who had not cried since the day he buried his father on a red dirt road in Oklahoma Territory, 12 years ago, bowed his head against his wife's shoulder. His body shook. The tears came silently, the way everything important happened with Eli, without noise, without spectacle, with a depth that words could not reach. I love you, he said. His voice broke on the words the way a dam breaks, not from weakness, but because what it was holding back had simply become too vast to contain. I think I have since the night you fell through my door. I know, Kestrel said. Her hand moved through his hair, gentle, steady. I have loved you since the night you sat in that rocking chair and stayed until I fell asleep. News traveled fast on a ranch where 5 men and a boy had been waiting, whether they admitted it or not, for exactly this announcement. Shep hugged Kestrel so hard that Eli had to remind him about the baby. Birch ran 3 laps around the cabin, yelling for no reason other than that he was 13 and this was the best news he had ever heard. Old Mose sat in his chair on the porch and smiled, which for Mose was equivalent to anyone else turning cartwheels. Breck said nothing. He disappeared into the smithing shed and did not emerge until the next morning. When he did, he was carrying a cradle. Hand-forged iron frame, sanded pine slats, a rocking base that moved as smoothly as water over stone. He had worked through the night. He set it on the porch, looked at Kestrel and said, For the little one, it is strong enough to hold through any storm. Kestrel ran her hand along the iron frame, felt the precision of the joints, the care in every curve. It is beautiful, Breck. He shrugged, his ears burning. It is just iron and wood. No, she said, it is not. The baby came in early March on a night when the stars were sharp and the mountain air was cold enough to see your breath. Doc Whitfield, who had returned from Santa Fe months earlier and had been checking on Kestrel weekly throughout her pregnancy, attended the birth. Eli stayed at Kestrel's side throughout, holding her hand, wiping her brow, speaking to her in the low, steady voice that had become her anchor in every storm. The labor was hard. It was long. There were moments when Eli's face went gray with fear, when the sounds coming from the bedroom made Breck pace the kitchen floor like a caged animal, and Shep sit motionless at the table, unable to read, unable to speak, able only to wait and hope. Then as dawn broke over the Sangre de Cristos, a sound split the silence of the cabin. Thin, furious, indignant, the cry of a new life announcing itself to the world. "A boy," Doc Whitfield said, placing the infant on Kestrel's chest. Strong lungs, all his fingers and toes. A fine, healthy boy. Eli looked at his son, red-faced, dark-haired, impossibly small, lying against his mother's skin with the particular expression of outrage that newborns wear when they discover that the world is larger and colder and louder than the one they have just left. "Look what we made," he whispered. Kestrel's face was exhausted, luminous, transformed by a joy that she had not known existed until this moment. "Matthew," she said. "Matthew Thomas Cole." "After my father," Eli said. "And yours?" "Naka chose Thomas." She said in English, "It is the closest sound to my father's name in Apache." Eli leaned down and kissed his son's forehead. Then he kissed his wife. Brief, gentle, reverent, the kiss of a man who understood that he had been given more than he deserved and was determined to earn it every day for the rest of his life. In the kitchen, Breck heard the baby's cry and sat down heavily on a chair. His enormous hands covered his face. His shoulders shook. Shep put a hand on his brother's back and left it there. Old Mose poured coffee and said, "Well, the little bed is going to be needed after all." Birch burst through the front door, having apparently heard the cry from the barn, and skidded to a halt in the kitchen. "Is it here? Is the baby here? Can I see? Is it a boy or a girl? What is its name?" "Matthew," Shep said. "And yes, you can see, but quietly." Birch tiptoed to the bedroom door with the exaggerated care of a 13-year-old who believed that volume was the greatest threat to a newborn. He peered around the frame, saw Kestrel holding the baby, saw Eli standing beside them with an expression that the boy had never seen on that weathered, serious face before, and backed away with his own eyes suspiciously bright. "He is really small," Birch reported to the kitchen, "but Mr. Eli says he is perfect." "He is," Old Mose confirmed. "They all are." 1 year from the night Kestrel fell through the cabin door, Eli gave her a gift. It was evening. They were on the porch in their chairs the way they always were when the day's work was done. Matthew slept in Breck's cradle inside the iron and pine, holding him safe. The mountains were gold with the last light. Eli produced a small bundle wrapped in soft leather. Inside was a pendant, silver round on a fine chain. Breck had forged it. The face was engraved with a K so small and precise that it seemed less like a letter and more like a secret. The back showed the Sangre de Cristos at dawn matching her ring. And inside, when she opened the tiny hinge, a lock of dark baby hair, fine as spider silk. "Breck forged it," Eli said. "Shep cut the hair while Matthew was sleeping. Mose thought of the idea. Birch kept watch at the door so the baby would not wake up." He paused. "I just handed it to you." Kestrel held the pendant in her palm. She opened it. She looked at the tiny curl of her son's hair, dark as her own, dark as the night sky over the valley where she had found, against all expectation, a home. "4 men and a boy," she said. "Made one gift, and not a single one of you knows how to say something beautiful about it." "That is why we need you," Eli said. She looked at him, he looked at her. The amber of his eyes and the black of hers held steady the way the mountains held steady, the way the creek held its course through the valley, the way the roots of the old oak held the soil against every storm. "Put it on me," she asked. He fastened the chain around her neck. His fingers brushed her skin. They had been married for a year, and his touch still sent warmth through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Thank you," she said, "for this, for everything, for being the man you are." "Thank you for falling through my door," he said. She laughed. And the sound of it, full and free and real, carried across the porch and out into the evening, and mixed with the sound of the creek and the distant call of a coyote and the wind moving through the pines, and it became part of the valley, part of the ranch, part of everything that they had built together on a piece of land that had once held nothing but rock and silence and possibility. Kestrel touched the pendant at her throat. She touched the iron feather in her hair. She turned her wrists and looked at the scars, faded now silver against brown, permanent but quiet. Below them, the ring that Breck had forged. Above them, the hands that Eli held every night. Old Mose had been right. The scars did not disappear. But when she looked at them now, she thought of freedom. She thought of family. She thought of home. A coyote called from the ridge. The wind carried the scent of juniper and pine. The last light touched the peaks of the Sangre de Cristos and held there golden for one long, perfect moment before the stars took over. Inside the cabin, Matthew stirred in his cradle and made a sound that was not quite a cry and not quite a laugh, but somewhere in between the sound of a child who was born into safety and would never know what it cost. Kestrel smiled. She closed her eyes. Home.